Amos A. Joe Jordan is currently a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he previously served as president and CEO, and counselor at the Pacific Forum, where he served as president, as well as a senior fellow at the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University. Jordan has held the positions of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Acting Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance. A former U.S. Army Brigadier General and a West Point Department head, he was Professor of Social Sciences there for 17 years, with responsibility for its political science and economic programs. He also served as a member of President Bush's Intelligence Oversight Board, as a consultant to the National Security Council, at the Agency for International Development, and with other organizations. His service included being the international co-chairman of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, and co-chairman of the Korea American Wise Men Council. Among his publications is the widely used American National Security Policy and Process. Jordan received a BS from the U.S. Military Academy, a BA and MA in Philosophy, Political Science, and Economics from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and a PhD in International Relations from Columbia University. He and his late wife, Polly, served 2 missions for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The first was at the area headquarters in Hong Kong for Asian humanitarian programs, and the second was at BYU, Hawaii, acting as a visiting professor. General Jordan's career, his interests, his contributions have spanned economic, political, security, educational, and humanitarian and church programs. Some of us refer to him as Bishop Jordan still. I can't quite get that out of my mind. He has been a shepherd as well as a leader. I think when we reflect on the last 50 years, he has been a quiet cornerstone of faith and LDS values in the pursuit of national security in the United States of America. It's a little bit bittersweet to introduce him in a valedictory sense tonight, but we appreciate his being here to speak to us on the subject, It's Halftime in America, Major International Challenges Ahead. General Amos A. Jordan.
Thank you, Fred, for that generous introduction. For those of you who perhaps didn't read the fine print and think that halftime refers to the football season, you can quietly leave now. I won't be offended. No, it's halftime in America in quite a different way. It was halftime at the 2012 Super Bowl when Clint Eastwood said, quote, "It's halftime. Both teams are in their locker rooms discussing what they can do to win the game in the second half. It's halftime in America, too. People are out of work and they're hurting. We're all scared because this isn't a game. The fog of division, discord, and blame makes it hard to see what lies ahead." Close quotes. And then he went on to assert that we can and will find a way, pulling together, to win in the second half. He added, quote, "We find a way through tough times, and if we can't find a way, we'll make one." Close quotes. Despite the formidable challenges now facing our nation, I share Eastwood's basic optimism. This evening I will discuss several of those outstanding challenges and ways to meet and master them. The first and most immediate challenge, the overwhelming challenge facing us, is getting our national house in order. This task has a number of dimensions. I can only tackle 2 of them, the most urgent ones tonight: the nation's fiscal mess and the status of our K12 education. Others, important ones, such as chronic high unemployment, the growing gap between the richer and the poorer in our society, decaying national infrastructure, and so forth. These also merit attention, but we just don't have time to tackle all of them tonight. Our fiscal problem stems from the fact that as a nation, we have for at least the last 3 decades been spending more dollars than we've been taking in through taxation and other revenue measures. We've been making up the very large shortfalls by borrowing, essentially from abroad, mostly China, as well as from national bond buyers. These years of the locust have been, in effect, a matter of accruing a national debt that's almost overwhelming in its dimensions. It's approaching $17 trillion. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time grasping the idea of a trillion. I can think in terms of millions and maybe, when I'm sober, billions. But I just can't get a hold of the idea of a trillion. President Reagan had this same problem, and so he had his aides provide an example. They told him that if he had a stack of $1,000 bills, 4 inches thick, he would be a millionaire. And if that stack of $1,000 bills was 300 feet high, he'd be a billionaire. To be a trillionaire, the stack would reach deep into the stratosphere, some 60 miles. To measure our current national debt, the pile of $1,000 bills would have to reach about 1,000 miles deep into space. That 4-inch thick stack of $1,000 bills. And that illustration does not exaggerate our problem. We've been adding about $1 trillion of further deficit annually to that huge debt. Now, thanks mostly to sequestration, this year it won't be quite that bad. But these imbalances simply cannot be allowed to continue. Otherwise, the value of the American dollar will plunge, foreign trade will implode, and we'll no longer be able to find other nations that are willing to cover our borrowing. We have got to get our fiscal house in order. But the political system refuses to face the facts. Spending cannot be cut substantially without cutting huge, politically untouchable entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Controlling escalating health costs for Medicare and Medicaid is particularly necessary. And unfortunately, the new health care system, so-called Obamacare, finesses, it does not meet this problem of costs, of escalating costs. Now, facing the challenge of increasing revenues is equally or even more difficult than cutting spending. Politicians and tax increases simply do not inhabit the same universe. The only time you hear a politician talking about taxes is when he's talking about cutting them. It's clear that we have to have a complete reworking of our tax system and eliminating or sharply curtailing tax breaks that protect various groups or interests from taxes is one of the most important things that has to be done. It would not only permit overall lower rates, but would also promote fairness. But every tax break is guarded zealously by the favored groups or interests and their expensive lobbyists. Still, with political courage and effort, the challenge can be met. Last year, President Obama appointed a bipartisan commission, generally called the Simpson-Bowles Commission, to tackle the problem and to lay out a balanced program to sensibly manage a transition to solvency. And that commission did so. But sadly, its recommendations were shelved, quietly disappeared. Political courage was in short supply. A renewed effort akin to Simpson-Bowles is needed. We've got to bite the bullet, not only for the present, but for the future national solvency that your generation will need. So your political leaders, particularly senators and congressmen, should hear from you about deficits and debt. Putting our national house in order is also required because our national position in the international system rests on our economic strength. That economic strength is the basis for our military and political strength. Our ability to secure our interests, both at home and abroad, rests on economic strength. Our ability to provide aid to allies, to meet the threats that are constant. All of these prime interests are underpinned by economic strength. So our national economic health is absolutely essential. Turning to the topic of education, there's now considerable attention to education arising out of a growing awareness that our system, our nation system of K-12 education does not provide students adequate preparation for college or for careers in a globalized world. A world in which graduates from Provo High will not be competing for jobs with Seattle High, but with Shanghai High or Singapore High. Those graduates are the ones we have to be aware of and competing with. Moreover, the quality of K-12 education varies wildly in this country from state to state. Students in West Virginia or Mississippi, for example, are generally shortchanged, and shortchanged badly when compared with students from Oregon or New York, for example. Our international ranking for K-12 puts us in the middle of the national pack. Next, I think, to Bulgaria. We cannot continue to be a world leader if we're down in the pack. A coalition of educators, business leaders, and state governors has developed a national program. This is recent. It's called Common Core. It's aimed to rectify this shortfall. The Common Core standards provide a series of academic benchmarks that set the minimum skills a student should acquire at specific grade levels. And although all but 4 states have adopted Common Core, there continues to be scattered opposition and confusion, partly arising out of misperceptions and the erroneous idea that with Common Core, teachers across the nation will be required to teach a uniform curriculum with common materials and common coursework. But Common Core does not specify that level of specificity. We will still have local control of education. It will just be measured against benchmarks that will show us how well we're doing. Now, putting our national house in order in terms of finances and education, which at first blush seem to be largely domestic challenges, but with enormous international ramifications. Now, these are not the only priority tasks before us. There are a host of other first-order challenges, coping with climate change, countering terrorism, for instance, that also demand our attention. But there's not time to tackle all of those tonight. I want to look at a different kind of challenge, that provided by various nation states. And again, the list of possible subjects to examine is long. From the list, I have chosen two, China and Iran, that pose particularly interesting challenges. If you have other candidates we ought to look at, perhaps we can discuss them in the question and answer session. Now, China leads the list of any states that we need to examine. Its very size, 1,300,000,000 people, about 4 times our size. Its remarkable rapid economic growth, its booming international trade, its vigorous search for energy and other natural resources, its seat on the United Nations Security Council, its growing military strength, its vigorous diplomacy, its status as the number two largest economy in the world, second only to ourselves, which it won't be for long. All these combine to make it a primary international order. We must focus on China, and it will become an even more important actor in the future, for its economy is growing now at about 3 times as fast as the United States. It slowed down for 3 decades. It increased its gross national product about 10% a year. Now it's down to 7.5, 3 times our rate. I was asked at one juncture a few years ago to be a part of a group of international experts to come to Beijing for 2 weeks to examine its next 5-year plan. Because I had been lecturing and writing about international energy topics, I was invited to join as the group's energy expert. Now, I have a strong interest in China, have had for many years, visited there many times, but I jumped at this opportunity to get to know the planners and the plan. And after 10 days of working with and analyzing the 5-year plan and planners, our group was asked to debrief the Chinese top leadership on our findings and recommendations. I was to focus on energy. The debriefing room was relatively small, so that when I stood up to debrief Deng Xiaoping, who was the undisputed paramount leader of China, I was only 3 or 4 feet in front of him. And I said in my report that the plan called for coal production and consumption to rise rapidly over the next 5 years. And given that Chinese coal is mainly low quality and full of sulfur, I told Deng Xiaoping that burning more of it would result in major pollution, both in China and in Korea and Japan, where acid rain would be falling. I urged him to have China develop its natural gas, which was being neglected, and it could be an alternative to coal, at least for household consumption. I wasn't thinking then of global warming, which I probably should have been, but that obviously is in a major way involved as well. Now, Deng Xiaoping's vigorous response was surprising. He was holding an 8 or 10-inch long ivory cigarette holder with a burning cigarette in it. He excitedly and repeatedly jabbed at me with it while he was exclaiming, "You Americans burned coal when you were industrializing. Your railroads burned coal while you were industrializing. China will burn its coal as it industrializes and its railways expand." Well, that, of course, is what it's been doing, and I'm sure will continue to do. I read recently, I've not had a chance to check the facts yet, but I've just read that China is now emitting as much greenhouse gas as the rest of the world combined, and I suspect that's true, given the speed of their industrialization and given the quality of their coal. Because of its coal, not exclusively, but largely, China has a major environmental crisis on its hands. Its air and rivers are badly polluted. No one swims, no one eats river fish. You may recall that because of pollution, China shifted a number of factories out of Beijing at the time of the 2008 Olympics. In view of these facts, it's not surprising that an environmental movement has begun to develop across China, but it has an uphill battle. Some limited ground may be given by those pushing industrialization, but the pace of pollution will continue unless and until a combination of external pressures and popular distress will build a sufficient counter-pressure. The development and application of counter-pollution measures and technology is an arena in which the United States and China could readily share experiences and cooperate. We need to seize such opportunities for collaboration. In the first instance, we should do so because we have a number of common problems, common interests that can be best tackled jointly, such as pandemics, global warming, piracy, so on. We should also do so because we need to put our relationship with China on the basis of co-evolution, not just cooperation. Now, the term co-evolution is borrowed from biology. It means two entities evolving together in a way that's mutually beneficial. Adopting this concept for the United States-China relationship doesn't mean that we will submerge our national interests. Rather, we can continue to stand strongly for those interests while we seek for a commonality of growing interests with China. Co-evolution means that we're prepared to negotiate and cooperate continually in search of mutuality of interests. Whenever we don't have an underlying conflict, it should be possible to find ways to cooperate. The world needs us to do so. In all our dealings with China, we need to remember that its leaders view it as a rising power and the United States as a declining power, a dangerous declining power. The Chinese leaders are hard-headed realists. They are men of substance. They are men who have been tested. They have a meritocracy system in the Chinese Communist Party that is amazing. Had it been applied in the United States, 2012, I don't know who would have been the candidate, but it would not have been Mr. Obama. He would have been running a county in the system that the Chinese have. They're hard-headed realists. They view the world differently than we do, and they will take every opportunity to shape that world favorably, either by direct or indirect means. We are dealing with supremely qualified, driven leaders intent on making China number one. We can have no room among our analysts or our policymakers for panda huggers. We need hard-headed realists as much as China has. Beginning about 3 years ago, China adopted a much more assertive, even aggressive foreign policy. It is now at loggerheads with Japan, for instance, over a number of tiny rocky islands in the East China Sea. And more importantly, it's been increasingly assertive about its claims for dominion over the South China Sea and all the resources beneath the sea. Now that's a large body of water. And China only has a weak historical and geological basis for its demands for control. But despite this weakness, it has labeled control of that sea as a, quote, core interest, close quotes. Now, this is a policy-laden term, core interest, that it uses for Taiwan and Tibet, which now it's elevating the South China Sea interest to. Now, that claim for control is already causing ship-to-ship collisions and conflicts between Chinese naval vessels and Philippine fishing boats. The international community, including the United States, insists that the sea is an international waterway, as it has always been, and that claims regarding it have to be negotiated multilaterally. The Chinese have responded officially that if we insist that the waterway's nature is multilateral and claims concerning it have to be settled multilaterally, that is tantamount to a declaration of war against China, because it's a core interest of China's. We're in a situation where we cannot back off. It's hard to predict how this will evolve, but we can be sure that the South China Sea will be a future danger zone. Now, in addition to problems arising from China's assertiveness on the South China Sea, we have a relatively new, significant problem of increasing and numerous Chinese cyber attacks on American business, and these have been escalating. China denies responsibility for these, but the evidence, even pointing to a specific building in Shanghai as the source of the attacks, is conclusive. This is not a matter of individual hackers. This is China. We should also note that to back up its recent assertive diplomacy, China has begun a large-scale military modernization program. By its nature, that modernization is clearly aimed at pushing the United States out of the Western Pacific. It's also aimed at disabling Americans' military forces by blinding them. Last year, China shot down one of its dead space satellites to demonstrate its ability to cripple American forces, which are heavily dependent on space communication. Of course, American military has prepared measures to counter possible Chinese offensive actions, and despite China's attempts to conceal its modernization efforts, American intelligence has largely pinpointed them and their vulnerability to Western countermeasures. But this is a source of continuing and probably broadening and escalating tension. I suspect for decades of your young lives. We have strengthened various defense cooperation measures with our allies in the Western Pacific to include stationing a small marine force in Australia. And the countries of East Asia, and particularly of Southeast Asia, are anxiously trying to develop joint military exercises with us and otherwise strengthen defense cooperation as they sense growing Chinese pressure. Now let's turn to the second country briefly, Iran. It's perhaps the most urgent challenge we confront. The international community, including the United States, is strongly opposed to Iran's drive to become a nuclear weapons state. Iran insists that its development of nuclear energy is purely directed to peaceful purposes. It does have a pair of small nuclear reactors, but those do not begin to require the amounts of enriched uranium that Iran's centrifuges are spinning and producing. And Iran has recently added a number of additional centrifuges to those that are already in operation. Now, despite its on-again, off-again cooperation with the watchdog International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, it is plain that Iran is building a capability to become a nuclear weapons state. Whether it will proceed to that point is an open question. But given its malign activities in its neighborhood, including Syria, and its sponsorship of terrorists worldwide, it's hard to take Iran's claims that nuclear activities are peacefully directed seriously. Take them seriously. Israel views the nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat, which is not surprising since the former Iranian president Ahmadinejad declared that Israel should be wiped off the map. Now, bringing Iran to the negotiating table is difficult at this juncture. But otherwise, disaster looms, for Israel will surely attack as soon as it believes Iran has fashioned an atomic bomb, just the first bomb. To meet this danger, the United States should lead a further effort to strengthen sanctions on Iran. Those are already having a disastrous effect on its economy. And at the same time, the United States and its allies should mount a major public diplomacy effort within Iran to convince all Iranians that pursuing nuclear weapons will bring a devastating war. Now, there are some signs of hope on the horizon. We know that ultimate power in Iran is held by the Ayatollahs in Qom, not the politicians in Tehran. So the recent election of a relatively moderate president may weigh little. Yet his comments, I guess it must have been yesterday, that he has the authority to negotiate with the West are most hopeful. The Ayatollahs apparently have concluded that maybe the future of the theocracy is at stake. The Iranian public's obvious yearning for peace may also be a factor. Even so, the adversaries, Iran and Israel, are far apart, and war may in fact come. But we should try to hold Israel back from early strikes while we strive to get the IAEA and the international community in the act of finding a viable compromise. Now, I regret that time does not permit me to explore other major challenges such as terrorism, threats from North Korea, for instance. Perhaps we can talk about some of those in the question and answer. I began this lecture by citing an unlikely philosopher, Clint Eastwood. Let me close by citing another, somewhat more renowned philosopher, Winston Churchill. He was speaking during the dark hour for England in its conflict with Nazi Germany. He said, quote, "We must push forward, never retreat. Never, never, never." As you students face the challenges that I've listed, and others that you will discover, I hope and trust that you will push forward, never retreat, never, never, never. Thank you.
We would like to invite follow-up questions, and again, if you'd make your way to the mic over here, General Jordan will conduct the Q&A session.
Thank you.
But I had a question when you were talking about the expansion of China's interests in their region. And I was curious that if things escalated to some type of military involvement, who do you consider as China's greatest ally? And if things went on to a struggle, who would they call on to help them?
Well, at this point in time, China has no allies except North Korea, which is of dubious value. Indeed, the Chinese would gladly give them away if they could. It is able to count on Russia to walk beside it in a number of things, including votes in the UN. Although as a member of the UN Security Council, China can veto anything alone, it does like to have Russia beside it. But Russia and China have an uneasy relationship. I would not certainly call it an alliance, as for instance they did before Nixon and Kissinger broke it. We have a situation in which China has vast population pressures and a thirst for raw materials. Russia has vast open spaces in Siberia and to the east and considerable natural resources. So there's the basis for cooperation there, but there's also the basis for conflict. And so I do not expect there to be anything like a solid axis, if you will, of those two great powers. And the North Koreans, the Chinese just shake their heads because North Korea has no ability to export, so that the fuel and the food that it desperately needs because of the inefficiency of its system, it depends on China for. And China cannot risk North Korea imploding because they're likely to get hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of refugees across their common border. They certainly can't cope with that. And so they keep North Korea afloat, but its value as an ally is -10. Another question.
Hi, General Jordan. My question is, what can you say about the wisdom or lack thereof of any involvement in Syria right now by the U.S. or an international coalition?
In my view, the more distance we can take from Syria, the better. I do not relish the idea of our getting involved in another Middle East war. You can say that it can be very limited provision of assistance, for instance, to one side or the other, and I presume you would think it would be the anti-Assad forces. The trouble is, it's like getting a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't, and I'm afraid you get started there, and it can't end well. Syria is a major problem, but it's one that the international community needs to grasp, or its neighbors need to grasp. It's not a nettle for us to grasp. Despite the president's waffling on this subject, and I'm not sure where he came out with the latest waffle, but I do not think that there's any real prospect that will be precipitated directly into that mess. Let the United Nations sort out the question of the chemical weapons. Let the international community decide how to cope with those findings. And if the international community cannot do it, the United States should not step into the fray. Next question.
General Jordan, you expressed some concern about the national debt. We've had economists and policymakers who just say they're not worried about the national debt in comparison to the help we need in society. So they're saying we need to go forward, we need to keep borrowing money until the economy gets back on its feet. Why are you more worried about national debt than the economy?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to add to the debt in order to have economic growth. After all, until the 1960s, we had very little addition. We had a very small national debt, and we had sustained periods of economic growth. The national debt is a burden that we tie around our necks that inhibits growth. It's not an alternative to growth. It inhibits growth. So I'm worrying about the national debt because I'm worried about the solidity of our economy and our place in the world. And it doesn't trouble me in terms of growth because it's been proven, as far as history is concerned, that it does not preclude economic growth. Okay?
Do you think of North Korea as an actual threat, or are they just posturing?
Well, North Korea does a good deal of posturing. It's one of the things they're very practiced at, and they don't have much else to offer. Their basic posture is to threaten and create problems and then expect to be able to reap rewards when they decide to back off. And that, in fact, has happened a number of times. And so they've learned that that's a rather good ploy. Just now, we seem to have decided we don't want to play that game, and so they're going to have to find another game. The only problem that North Korea has at this point, as far as we're concerned, is that the new leader, a man who's in his late 20s, Kim Jong-un, who has no background and no apparent talent for international affairs or military affairs, is apparently in a place to largely call the shots. And that's the problem with this dynastic leadership that they have in, he's the grandson of the founder of North Korea. He's a man who's had some Western education, and we've had high hopes that he might bring some good sense to the office, but so far there's been absolutely no indication of it. So we don't know how the events are going to play out with North Korea, and the South Koreans who are just as strong-minded, just as hard-headed as the North Koreans, are the best people to deal with them. And they're a strong ally of ours, and I think we continue to work with them to make sure that they have at least equality, and I think by this time they probably have superiority in conventional forces. And North Korea is not stupid enough to use its nuclear weapons because it has relatively few, and it could be obliterated as a country very quickly. So I think there's an awful lot of bluster there, and they can cause all kinds of trouble by shelling isolated islands, by sinking warships, both of those gambits it's already tried. They can be a terrible nuisance, cause real problems for South Korea, but they can't upend the extraordinarily stable relationship that we have with China. China's not going to follow that will-o'-the-wisp.
How do you view Russia's role on the global stage, and do you consider them a threat?
I certainly do not consider Russia as a global threat, not by any means. Russia, which is still basically depending for all of its export earnings on oil and gas, and therefore is in a vulnerable position with the fall of oil and gas prices, and which has a military establishment that could not fight its way out of a wet paper bag, and which has no friends in Central Europe, let alone Western Europe, and which has the problems that so many countries are now beginning to experience of a declining birth rate to the point that its workforce, its people subject to military draft, etc., those numbers are declining. It's a country, in other words, that is not going to recover anything like the glory of the old Soviet Union, and I certainly do not think of them as a threat to American national security. Okay.
Lately, there's been some conservative Republicans calling for a shutdown of the national government in order to defund Obamacare. And I was wondering what could be some potential benefits or consequences from such a government shutdown?
Well, it's hard for me to see any benefits from shutting down the U.S. government. Even the leadership of the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate have said that's not a good idea. What they have to cope with is a right-wing, Tea Party-activated faction in their ranks. And how they're going to manage that, I don't know, but I suspect that they're not going to try to use the debt limit or the continuing resolution ahead of us to try to shut down the government, because I think most Americans will clearly blame it on the Republicans. Certainly the Democrats are doing their best to see that happens, and the media are very much in this cheering them on. And I think that basically level-headed people that are neither left nor right think that shutting down the government is not a good idea. So they may do it. They may do it, but they'll pay the consequences electorally next year if they do. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
General, how do you think China's rise will affect our relationship with nations like India and Indonesia?
It's a very interesting question about how China's rise affects our relationships with the other two major power centers in East Asia, or South and East Asia, namely India and Indonesia. India, in the days of, let's say, 1940s, 50s, and right up into the 60s until Nehru died, the Indians and the Chinese were basically cooperating. Hindi Shini Bye Bye was the cry. That's India and China are brothers. That evaporated quickly. In 1962, the Chinese attacked India up along its northern boundary, quibble over lands, and in fact, the Chinese were prepared and the Indians were not. The Indians had to move forces up there from essentially sea level, a few hundred feet above sea level, up to 13,000 feet, and they couldn't fight for a week or 10 days. And so the Chinese just ran over them. And as a consequence, they not only administered a strong defeat, but when they didn't pull back on the northeastern front of India, they did pull back on the northeastern front, they did not pull back on the northwestern front, so they still occupy lands that the Indians claim. And so there's a continuing border quarrel, if you will, between India and China. There's beginning to be a naval quarrel. China's decided it wants to become a sea power. And so it's in the business of acquiring carriers, building submarines, and so forth. And the Indians, who believe the Indian Ocean should be controlled by India, are very disturbed by this and are beginning to build up their own naval forces. There's also the conflict of who is going to have the influence in Southeast Asia. And this is where Indonesia and Vietnam are the principal nations. Neither case do they welcome Chinese influence. Indonesia in the 1950s had a bloodbath in their revolution, a bloodbath in which Chinese were killed willy-nilly because of the activities of the Chinese Communist Party and because so many of the rice traders were Chinese and were hated. Chinese were killed by the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. So there's absolutely no love lost between China and Indonesia. And the natural antipathy and, if you will, antagonism between China and India is also a continuing factor. So most of those countries in South and Southeast Asia are concerned about the growth of China's strength and power, and they want to get closer to the United States. They are offering port facilities and joint exercises and everything they can think of short of an outright alliance to try to get closer to the Americans as they fear the growing strength of China.
Recently, we've seen a rise in politicians advocating isolationist-style policies. How do you respond to America withdrawing from its international obligations? And what would you suggest we do to help Americans re-engage?
Well, it's hard for me to provide a really rational response to an irrational question. Not that you're irrational. Well, I'm telling you, the people that pose it, you know, we may want to ignore the world, but the world is not going to ignore us. We're in it. We're of it. Our interests are wholly engaged. If we don't recognize that, somehow try to avoid it, we just beg and borrow trouble for ourselves. Because other nations are not going to respect American abstention. They're going to pursue their interests, encouraged by the fact that the Americans are not going to be opposing them or in any way trying to frustrate them. So we would produce a more dangerous world if we tried to abstain. And we'd have the probability that if we began to pull back, the alliances that we have developed over the decades in the world would disintegrate and add another element of instability into the international system. You know, we haven't said anything at all about Europe in this session. The Europeans, of course, have more than enough troubles of their own right now because they have still not recovered from the 2008 downturn. They are still mired in their various petty difficulties. The European Union is fragile, and it's too much perhaps to say they're tottering, but they're weak and there's no sign of quick and easy recovery. So that we cannot count on Europe to help with the various tasks in the international system, except occasionally and in some UN votes. We can count on the British and the French and the Germans and the Poles in many cases, but not all. It was interesting that even the Brits did not want to follow the president in any kind of a Syrian adventure. So that we have a problem of maintaining an international system in which the other major players are not always playing by the same set of rules. And the United States cannot afford any weakening, cannot afford any dithering, cannot afford any loose lips about what we're going to do in Syria or elsewhere. So you all are inheriting a difficult world, but a world in which the United States has ample resources and plenty of bright people such as yourselves to take advantage of them. I wish you well.